Because of the fresh flavor that's retained, the good color, and so on, freezing is one of the favorite methods for preserving fruit these days. We're going to try preserving blackberries 3 different ways, any of which will work in your home. However, you get different results when you use the different methods, and you may want to actually have some fruit that you've got in the freezer that's prepared each of the different ways for different uses. The first one is the easiest. We've simply taken the blackberries in and we've washed them. Now, the reasons we wash them are basically a couple. One is simply to remove dirt. Another is if you have any residues of sprays, those will come off as well. There are also maybe a few insects and so on that we also want to get rid of. Now, in order to do this, you need to have some kind of a freezer container. I'm using a flexible container today, but you could use any of the kinds of containers that we're going to look at later on. Don't use things that aren't made for the freezer, because blackberries are too good to lose to freezer burn, which is what will happen if your wrapping isn't specially designed for freezer use. Now, we're simply going to take a spoon and try real carefully not to crush them and pack them into our freezer bag. Now, the number you put in the bag may depend on if you have a favorite recipe, for instance, that you know requires a certain amount. You may want to measure that amount of blackberries into the dish. If you're going to, into the container, if you're going to be using them for just eating, you're not sure what you're going to use them for, then you need to fill them fairly full. This one's a little bit lower than we'd like to have. We're actually going to be putting it in the freezer at this point in time. Then zip it as much as you can, or whatever kind of freezer seal you've got on this particular one. Push it fairly close to the edge. You can then either press the air out, you can insert a straw and suck the air out, but get as much of the air out as you can without crushing the berries. The straw method works real well, because a lot of the other methods, you lay it on the table, you pat it down, and they may be crushed. Now, at this point, you also want to make sure you've got a good label on this product. You want to make sure that we know that these are dry packed blackberries, the date, which may include the month, day, and year. It may include just the month and the year, depending on how many of them you're going to be putting in at one time. But make a fairly thorough label. Include the amount of sugar you have in there, because later on you may need to know that when you're going to make a recipe with it. If you know how much sugar you've got in the berries, you can reduce that from the recipe itself. The second method, again, is relatively easy and well used. This one, we're going to put some berries into a bowl, again dry packing them, and we're going to put a small amount of sugar on them. Now, in general, for a quart, you'd use about 3/4 to 1/2 cup of sugar, depending on how sweet they are. You can judge that by taste, and again, make sure you note the amount of sugar you've got it on the label. It's a little bit humid here. We've got the top caking up. I'm just going to put in a small amount there. We won't use it all. And gently stir them together, because berries crush so easily. Now, I did wash these ahead, as I said. You don't want to wash them until right before you're ready to freeze them, because they will lose moisture, they'll lose quality. And when you drain away black juice from your blackberries, you're also draining away the flavor and the sugar of the berry itself. I'm going to use a rigid container to do this variety of freezing. This is called a dry sugar pack. The reason I'm doing that is because the sugar is going to draw some of the moisture out of the berry itself. And we want to have something that we know is not going to leak. This kind of container also stacks very well in the freezer. Again, without pressing down, we want to make sure we have as many as possible in there. We don't have a lot of syrup on here. There's not going to be much expansion. So we can tap this gently on the palm of our hand. And then we can squeeze in a few more, doing the same kind of thing. If you have just a few berries left and it's not going to completely fill the container, what I'd recommend, I'm going to take that one out. I don't want to crush any of them. What I'd recommend is that you take a piece of wax paper, crumple it up, and put it on the top. That will take up a lot of the air space. The air is what causes the berries to get freezer burn, causes a lot of the deterioration. During expansion, the wax paper will just go ahead and crumple also, so that you should be able to have a fairly good product with as little air as possible in there by doing it that way. Again, the labeling is very, very important for this one as well. The last method requires a little bit of advanced work. This one has a sugar syrup that we're going to put on it. Now, some people would think, well, why don't we just put it in water? The dry pack will keep very well. If you serve them when they're still frosty, they'll still taste pretty good. But the sugar helps do more than just add sweetness. It also helps preserve the texture, it helps preserve the color, and it helps preserve the flavor of the berry itself. Now, dry packing will help that. Sugar syrup is one of the best ways to do those kinds of preservation methods, however. Now, again, with this one, we're simply going to put some of the berries into a freezer jar or another kind of freezer container. Again, a rigid container is best because we're going to be adding a lot of liquid to it, and we don't want it spilling out anywhere. Tapping it down, get as many berries in as possible. Now, because we're adding a sugar syrup, we need to leave headspace, and the size of the jar is going to make a difference as to how much headspace you use in the freezer. And it's not as critical that the berries not actually touch the top as if you're canning. With a quart jar, you'd want to leave 1 inch of headspace for expansion. With a pint jar, 1/2 inch will probably be sufficient, or will be sufficient. The sugar syrup we made ahead of time, and I'm using a medium sugar syrup, which is 2 cups of sugar to 2 cups of water, or 4 cups of water, excuse me. We bring that to a boil so the sugar is well dissolved, and then make sure you let it cool, because if it hasn't had a chance to cool, the berries are going to be cooked in it. You don't have to worry about getting air pockets out the way we do with canning. I'm going to take one more of these out here a little bit there. Put a little bit more syrup in, and then simply put a lid and a band on. Now, unlike canning, where once we get these stored, you take the bands off, these are going to stay in place because we're not going to get a seal on these. These are going to go into the freezer, and it's the temperature change that's going to preserve them, not the fact that we've eliminated all the oxygen and so on. These are 3 methods, easy methods for preserving blackberries and other fruits during the summer. Hope you'll find them useful. For Oklahoma Gardening, this is Barbara Brown.